I prefer lunch. I prefer savoury conversation. I prefer to sit at the children's table. I prefer time off without good behaviour. I prefer going home from parties. I prefer reuse, repeats. I prefer to play in defence. I prefer half-varnished nails. I prefer words. I prefer Szymborska's lines about preferring the absurdity of writing poems to the absurdity of not writing poems. I prefer to idolise. I prefer noise in a museum. I prefer a waning moon. I prefer to be able to hear the sea. I prefer to dance with my eyes closed. I prefer double denim. I don't prefer capitalism. I don't have a preferred alternative that I can articulate. I prefer rainbows. I prefer cleaning the toilet to reality TV. I prefer sources, sources and source. I prefer Connect 4 to Cards Against Humanity. I prefer unfinished business. I prefer cut and paste. I prefer the absurdity of hope to the absurdity of the mundane. I prefer being shown to getting told. I prefer where there's water to get wet. I prefer to look history square in the face, kiss her gently and say, let's go another round together.
From one end of the beach, I see my children all the way at the other. Silhouettes rush at water, then retreat up sand as waves chase and almost catch their feather-light feet. They stop, lean in, consult, hover, then purposefully work, carrying things back and forth, bringing items to evaluate, discarding many, keeping only the right ones. I am too far to see the treasures they choose and assemble with care, but I hear their voices tinkle my way on gray air, soft chimes in my ear. Their tiny forms squat over a mound of feathers, seaweed, and shells, larger scallop shapes wedged around the edge, a barricade against everything. A stick and seagrass cross at the head. They know how to build a proper penguin grave. Up close now, I hear them whisper wishes for this wee blue one, forever and safe and hush. I wait for them to finish. Some things you cannot rush. Time to rest. One gray day, the earth decided to sleep. The mighty mountains shrugged their rounded shoulders and sighed a great necessary sigh. The wide seas sucked their liquid breath in and out in deep soothing swells. The earth turned inward. Oil stopped flowing. The flat plains coughed a dry cough, and the mantis-like machines creaked to a halt. The ocean floor sneezed a satisfying sneeze and swallowed the drilling platforms whole. People who lived on the planet scurried around noisily looking for shelter, and those who could took flight to new frontiers. Some, the quiet ones, stayed behind and made peace with the sleeping mother. Soon all activity ceased, and the only thing audible was the sound of sleep in a world that emerged ecstatic with fragrance and color. Tiara and jasmine shouted happy stories across continents. Magnolias made mad love as their roots stretched deep into wet, fertile soil, while sequoia and kauri reached with their arms towards heaven. And the mighty mountains sighed, and the wide seas heaved, and the earth dreamed blue-green dreams.
I prefer the taste of hard-earned sweat. I prefer my grand's macrocarpa hedge and the world that hides inside to the neighbour's plain lawn. I prefer the sea's tongue as an exfoliator. I prefer colour, and if I could erase black and grey, I would. I prefer deep and meaningful conversations to the disingenuous. How are you? Great. I prefer hugs, kisses and words in any order. I prefer blankets of compassion to sterile pats on my shoulder. I prefer the smell of summer and cut grass. I prefer popcorn rain on a tin roof to a misty drizzle and umbrellas. I prefer to run during a storm emerging drenched and delighted. I prefer Tui's soliloquy over the traffics. I prefer Papa Tūānuku breathing calmly when we're behaving. I prefer this very second in time, and this one, and this.
I prefer to walk beside the water. I prefer to be in the sea. I prefer the shimmer of last light to the inertia of 2 o'clock. I prefer prickly dune tracks to roads. I prefer to be out in the storm. I prefer ancient Manuka ridgelines to river valleys. I prefer streams, though these take me through valleys. I prefer to go up and need the balance of sea level. I prefer underground water to stay deep. If I must meet it, I prefer to meet it in the ocean. I prefer to thank my ancestors and enter the layered waterfalls of forgiveness. I prefer to walk deliberately forward. I prefer a place to stand and a place to lie down. I prefer compassion to blame. I prefer shoulders next to mine. I prefer a cloak of found feathers to a rucksack of old stones. I prefer the possibilities of love.
When we were crazy young, we listened, eyes shut, to the pound and run of the very thought of magic, as if to warm a dormant bud, open some hidden valve deep in the blood's dark valleys. Behind our eyes, colours of crushed black carbon, of velvet plush scarlet, burnt sienna, the thin sustained ring of some mind wire opening its note at the top of the spine, the force of want that could stiffen the joints, swell the ribs, full body straining with the hunger to be wonder's chosen emissary. Surely if the urge was strong enough, it would run the nerves' flared webs, spill bioluminescence that we could tap like blazing tapers to animate wood, paper, wool, mud, grain, paint, flour, the spiky shadows that furniture threw, fingerprint smudge on boredom's walls, even the small chainsaw of a fly's hectoring whine. How we willed our touch to tornado and twister that torpid humdrum like some hybrid oar that would sway and soar, skin scented like crushed sage, breath like sipped nasturtium, lower its head to listen, as if we were each a lacquered music box where our raw thoughts plinked and bumbled their young syllabary. Yet even so, beast, haunch-hunkered, gaze flood-swollen, it would still turn to each of us, gaze savage but godly, with a revolutionary love.
For my daughter. I prefer good posture. Yours is ballerina good. I prefer that your eyes are all the colours of the Kia. I prefer family holidays where we are allowed to breathe. The camper van was a mistake. I prefer that you are cheerfully late, unlike the person waiting. I prefer it when you use less than 4 towels per shower. I'd prefer it if you knew that the white thing in the garage is a washing machine. If you're interested, I can show you how it works. I prefer that you pay attention to your baking. I prefer that your poems need no editing. They are here in the now, and so are you. You have been here before. I prefer that Ireland keeps an eye on all of her children. The hills above Annascaul recognise your footsteps. Welcome back, child, says the sign. You remind me of how much I like the Welsh. I prefer that you prefer mountains. That Rakiura took you into her heart until you got to the South Seas Hotel. What were you doing in the South Seas Hotel? I prefer it when you are silly. I prefer to watch you doing burpees. Your legs too long for your arms. You look like a baby giraffe. I prefer that you use Bondi Sands with abandon, and you're still the palest. I prefer your random rules to get you out of running uphill. I would prefer that you never take up darts or work in ER. I prefer that your friends are awesome and that they like me because I like them. I would prefer my son to choose my nursing home because he will look harder for dust in the corners. He would prefer that you don't keep thumping him because you have no idea of your own strength. I prefer when you bake together that you do the actual baking. He eats all the mixture and I'm not sure he's washed his hands. I prefer that you tolerate your dad like a Buddhist when he's over-explaining physics. I prefer that once on Good Friday at a triathlon, you said you knew how Jesus was feeling. I prefer your ability to live your life like lap 3 of the 1500 metres, when you need to. I prefer watching you lolly scramble. I prefer that time we made jewellery together. I imagined we were silversmiths from Celtic kingdoms crafting treasure. I made you a ring. I would prefer that your sheet, duvet and pillowcase are a matching set in the back window of the car when you leave home. I would prefer that you come round for Sunday dinner every week, or just ring for a natter. I prefer keeping the faith. In the silence between when you were born and when you were alive, you were just getting ready.
I prefer the just in case of a trap for heffalumps. I prefer to tap dance in bare feet. I prefer lipstick that doesn't kiss the rim of a glass. I prefer jaffas. I prefer giggling. I prefer the true aim of javelin throwers. I prefer songbirds defrosting in spring. I prefer spring with its beacons of light. I prefer to be with you offline. I prefer French horns. I prefer the possibility of prayer bell earrings. I prefer a torch in the dark. I prefer silence without conditional verbs. I prefer to turn the page. I prefer the endangered application of common sense. I prefer the democracy of learning. I prefer to learn the language of trees. I prefer black stilts and braided rivers. I prefer bubbles that float away. I prefer that literacy and literature hold hands. I prefer the live tongue of talking. I prefer blue pencils for writing the sky. I prefer to walk at my speed of light. I prefer parallel lines that veer off course.
I prefer weather. I prefer weather on my horizon. Remember, it was fear that sent us to the moon, shoe prints like gray scuffs in a subway station, sneaking under the silent roads of our nation. Remember, it was fear that sent us to the moon. I prefer stars reflected in the eyes of a space dog, spinning above the silent roads of our nation, the loyalty of orbit falling on and on and on. I prefer stars reflected in dark concentric circles. Dive into black water and you will learn, falling on and on and on, that bioluminescence makes a ghost of you, shadows what will come. Because when you climb from the black water, you're gone. I prefer being salty to sweet. I prefer tomorrow's ghosts, the red shift over blue, knowing the universe grows, the space it grows into. After you're gone, remember, time is shaped like a figure 8. That's what makes us safe. I prefer growing into what we have lost. The smoking rooms on airships, where one man held the lighter, that's what made them safe. Not just anyone could walk around with fire. Smoking rooms are a thing of the past, and living is a foreign language you learn as you go. Not just anyone knows that prison is the same word in English and in French. So is poem. I prefer the foreign. When I was young, I cut and glued moonshots, far-off news of the Russians. We want to know words we are not allowed to know. I prefer not to make bold statements in writing. The magazines called 1989, The End of History, tell that to now. I prefer the absurdity of writing boldly in the accent of a dialect learned late. Gray shoe prints in a subway station, the frayed edges of a long shot waiting for the train. Possibility. I prefer weather on my horizon.
I prefer going to Hollywood cinema on Mariner Street to Netflix and chill. No cats or dogs, I prefer native birds. I prefer the space where the forest changes to silver beach from fern in the depths of Fiordland. I prefer O'Hara to Ginsberg. I prefer Marmite. I prefer myself loving love to myself obsessed with whether or not they'll call. I prefer keeping a hanky on hand because in my family we cry easily. I prefer to turn my rings around 3 times if I glimpse the full moon through glass, just in case. I prefer Mal in slippers with Wallace Chapman on a Sunday. I prefer not to maintain the links in email chain letters. I prefer the possibles over the probables. I prefer to write it down. I prefer the real meme. I prefer a letter. I prefer you in leather. I prefer creative, non-work related assignments. I prefer deviations. I prefer the last minute dash to the airport. I prefer the car park to the waiting room. I prefer the old songs to the new album. I prefer the absurdity of writing poems to the absurdity of not writing poems. I prefer, where love's concerned, to speak the truth faster. I prefer the quick rip of the sticking plaster. I prefer the promise of frost, foraged cocktails, getting lost over finding myself. I prefer you to wake me up before you go. I prefer Papatuanuku to uphold me. I prefer 72% cocoa. I prefer Badidas. I prefer having some questions. I prefer the columns to the headlines. I prefer to be the one who leaves rather than the one who's left behind. I prefer grating cheese to vacuuming. I prefer Art Garfunkel's Bright Eyes to Bonnie Tyler's Turn Around Bright Eyes equally. I prefer keeping the cupboards closed and the windows open while sleeping. And when I sleep, I prefer to sleep diagonally. I prefer many things that I haven't mentioned here, to the many things I've also left unsaid. I prefer not to know what's coming. I prefer zero cool and zero gravity to zero liability. I prefer to be doing a manual task outdoors when bringing up difficult subjects. I prefer to let fantails out the same way they came in. I prefer keeping in mind every possibility that begin, beni, bien are anagrams of being for a reason.
I prefer natives to introduced species. I prefer quiet authenticity. I prefer meaningful connection to systemic avoidance. I prefer autumn, safe in the knowledge that everything has a life cycle. I prefer to expose the greying strands of my hair. I prefer kōrero in person as opposed to communicating via the internet. I prefer to sing aloud in the car. I don't prefer silent, unspoken things. I prefer non-martyred compromise. I prefer to tend my wounds before creating them for another. I prefer compassion to witch hunts. I prefer to believe in the possibility of something beautiful, rather than fear the inevitable pain of loss. I prefer to choose aroha.